Cogitanti mihi saepe numero et memoria vetere repetenti, per beati fuisse quinte frater, illi videri solent, qui in optima republica, cum erenoribus et rerum gestaurum gloria florerent, eum vitae cursum tenere potuerunt, ut vel in negotio sine periculo, vel in otio cum dignitate esse possent. Ac fuit cum mihi quoque initium requiescendi, atqui animum adutriusque nostrum praeclara studio referendi, fore justum et propeab omnibus concessum arbitrar si infinitus forensium rerum labor et ambitiones occupatio de cursu honorum et aetatis flexu constitisset. Okay, I think I see the problem. When it said Cicero on your iPad, you thought I was going to talk about Cicero on the iPad, not read you Cicero from the iPad for an hour, right? Okay, let me think about this for a second. I can talk about Cicero on your iPad, I can do that. I'd really like to, in fact, now that I think about it. There's a lot just in, this is the first sentences from his great treatise, De Oratore, on what makes a great speaker. You'll see that I haven't read enough of it yet, but that's another story. And I'd really love to talk about this, but I get a sense maybe that wouldn't especially work either. Okay, let me get a little professional help from a colleague here. This is Punxsutawney Phil, it's still his month. A few more hours. Let me see if I can do something different. So what you just saw was me reading Cicero on an iPad. Those words are over 2,000 years old. They've been read by a lot of people since then. They're pretty good words. There is some sense in which what I was just doing is exactly what a reading slave was doing for a Roman senator somewhere in the 50s BC. But there's a little more electricity involved in the way we're doing it than was ever involved in 50 BC. Stuff has changed. And that's a worthy first thing to say. Reading was invented a very long time ago, but reading goes through changes every time people and their technologies go through changes. Do the sketchiest of brief histories. In the earliest days of writing, we get authors writing down things. Plato's seventh letter and the Phaedrus are famous for this, in which they say that writing is going to ruin everything. It's this newfangled modern technology. It's going to suck the brains right out of you. Memory will go away forever because you won't have to remember anything because it will all be there in writing in some way or another. So far, the evidence that civilization as we know it would come to an end because of writing is sketchy at best. It's taking a while. But on the other hand, there's an important sense in which they were right. If you knew stuff before writing was invented, you knew stuff. It was yours. You carried it around with you. You didn't misplace it. You didn't have to look it up. You had it with you. But, and this is thematic, you couldn't possibly know as much without writing as you can know with writing. There have still been a few people. There was a man about 20 years ago who memorized all of the Iliad and could recite it to you in Greek. Last I saw, Boris Johnson, the classics-trained mayor, Lord Mayor of the City of London, was setting out on the same process. He's going to memorize the entire Iliad for repetition. He's done 155 lines so far. Good luck to a great guy. Each stage in the history of writing and technology has brought us new ways of reading, new possibilities. So if writing brought you knowledge without memory, you could just read it. The Codex book, our traditional pages bound at the back, which came in the first centuries AD and had something to do, this is controversial, with the rise of Christianity, by which I really only mean that there's some evidence that there were more Christians than anybody else using that particular form early, and it had something to do with their community. Well, that brought you the possibility of reading without being a slave to the writer's sequence. If you're reading the Iliad in a papyrus roll, you start at the beginning, you scroll, 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 scroll. You've got to go through from beginning to end. You get to the end, and this may be the last time I can ever tell this joke, because of the change of technology, and there was a little thing called the colophon, which is Greek meaning be kind, rewind, and you had to crank back in the other direction and so forth. You may be the last generation that gets that one, and I promise to retire it now. But when you were doing that, you needed to read the Iliad pretty much in Mr. Homer's direction. If you got 2/3 of the way through the book and wanted to remember something, it was rewind, rewind, rewind. That wasn't a lot of fun. If you wanted to cheat ahead to the end, it was wind, 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 and you probably didn't do that. The Codex book has many advantages, but one of which is you, the reader, have the power to decide where you are and to move around rapidly inside it. One thing that early Christian writers learned to do with the Codex book that they couldn't do with the scroll was index the Gospels so you could match up parallel stories from one Gospel book to another. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell the same story, but they tell it very differently. So starting in the 4th century, there were things called Eusebian canon tables, in which at the beginning of your Gospel manuscript there were tables of numbers. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tables of numbers. And so paragraph 29 in Matthew might be paragraph 12 in Mark, and these were marked in the margins. You could flip back and forth, and you could sort out the whole when did Jesus cleanse the temple of the moneylenders issue to your own satisfaction. That's power in the hands of the reader. Print, of course, brought a whole different kind of power. It meant you didn't have to be as rich as you used to have to be in order to have a book. And it meant you didn't have to be in the place where the book was produced. Books could travel around more abundantly. Books could be in different places. You could take them with you. They were more compact. They were somewhat cheaper. The history of print is the history of making books cheaper and cheaper over time, and therefore of making the ability to move information around to improbable places go better and faster than ever before. A limit case of that was a few years ago at our annual convention of classicists. I saw a famous book about the Greeks in Bactria, which is roughly Afghanistan into India. And I said, yeah, I'd like to own a copy of that one. Oh, this secondhand copy is $144. I don't think I'm going to go for that. I'll go home and look it up on Abe Books. Looked it up on Abe Books, found I could get it for $2.50 plus $3 shipping, brand new hardcover edition. Say what? I said, click, click, I'll take it. It showed up about 3 weeks later. It had been printed, most wonderfully, by Oxford University Press, India. It was on the cheap Indian paper with the show-through print and the cheap binding, but I got it for $5. And this book, written by an Oxford classicist a half a century and more ago about exotic affairs far, far away, was now in my hands cheaply and easily because some people out there in those lands had the same technology that they have in England and the United States, and even the same technology of shipping, that they could get it to me for such a paltry price. We have all grown up in a world in which that kind of information and access to information was taken for granted. We've built up a culture around it. Now, of course, it is conventional to say that we're living in a world in which everything is changing very rapidly about access to information. It isn't just that I can have Cicero on this device. If I wanted all of Cicero on this device, I could have all of Cicero on this device. I came to the limit in that case a few years ago when a student of mine, now a professor, said, well, I'm teaching at this institution where they don't have the standard online database of Latin works by Christian writers. You've got it there at Georgetown. Is there any way you could? I said, not a problem. So I went online and I downloaded 5 million words, Latin words, of the works of Augustine. They've survived handwritten copies over and over again for 1,600 years. I then very carefully packaged up 5 million words. I digress. When I started my career, I got about half those words in 22 volumes with Spanish translation on the foot of the page for $75. When I was young, that was real money. Packaged it all up carefully, and I sent her the complete works of Augustine in a greeting card. That is to say, I had one of these mini CDs. You don't see them very often, but they're these little CDs about 3 inches in diameter. Loaded up my 5 million words, dropped it in a greeting card, said, Dear Jen, here it is, enjoy. And Augustine flew across the country courtesy of the United States Postal Service and now lives far, far away. There's such an abundance of information, such an abundance of things to read. Of course, we might not read as much as we used to. My colleagues at Georgetown have made it a mantra, which I in turn got from my spouse. When we discover that people aren't quite paying attention to what we've been saying, My mantra is, nobody reads anything anymore. It's not quite true that nobody reads anything anymore, but I've learned to be careful about writing 3- and 4-page memos. About 2 years ago, I wrote one of those on a project we've been working on for some time. I drafted, it was about a 7-page memo, put a lot of work into it, a lot of thought, a lot of people had helped on this. It was great. Handed it around to my senior staff, and one of my best people came back to the meeting and said, "So Jim, you know, it's really well written, but..." And essentially what he wanted to say at that point was, could we make it a little shorter? Could we get some bullet points? Could we have a couple of headers? You got any illustrations? Would this maybe work a little better as a PowerPoint? And I had to acknowledge that on some level he was mostly right. It may be because the week before we'd had the angry faculty leaders in the office complaining about some other memo that I had written. And so we sat them down and said, so what are some of your concerns about this memo? Could we start with the paragraph on page 1 that says blah-de-blah? And they looked down startled and said, it says blah-de-blah? Oh, I didn't see that. George, did you see that? No. Oh, okay. Oh, well, that's really good. I could see one of my staff mouthing the words at that point, nobody reads anything. When there's so much material, it's hard to get focus and attention. And that's kind of what I want to talk about this evening. Each age and stage in the history of writing and reading has its own ways of reading, its own culture that it builds. There are a lot of things that we can talk about when we talk about contemporary electronic texts that I'm not going to talk about. I could do a review of Kindle versus Kindle Fire versus iPad, and I could kvetch about a variety of things. I really hate the keyboard issue with the iPad, thank you, but it's even worse with the Kindle, oi. I could worry about the pricing of things. My spouse and I, again, are having an ongoing seminar on the pricing of e-books and what we're willing to pay and what we're not willing to pay. She's a great reader and connoisseur of contemporary crime fiction. For her, a significant part of the pleasure of buying the new hardcover crime novel is the pleasure of putting it in a box about 2 months later and taking the box over to the hospice, not far from where we live, to share the book with other people. Right now, you can't do that with an e-book. We've discovered that we can't even do all the things we want to do on e-books with separate Amazon accounts. She's got to log into my account to do a bunch of the stuff because of the restrictions. I'm not going to kvetch about any of that stuff. None of that is really interesting. And in fact, there are technological forces and market forces that will solve the issues that are pressing issues. If the price point that we're all really willing to pay for electronic books is more like the $3.99 we pay for renting a video, that's where the price will go. This stuff happens. If we all really want good keypads, they'll find a way to put good keypads associated somehow or another with your iPad. I'm not going to worry about that. There are other issues that I do worry about that I just want to point to in passing that I'm not going to talk about this evening. One of them goes under the technical term in library world of metadata. Metadata is a fancy word for the information on the MARC record catalog card or the library online system that tells you accurately and carefully just what this thing is. Go try to find a Google book or a digital book on Amazon or even order a book from Abe Books and try to figure out whether you're getting the hardcover or the paperback or the original translation or the other translation or whether you've got all the volumes. I have spent half an hour with volume 2 of something from Google Books looking to figure out whether volume 1 or volume 3 are available and not being able to convince myself at the end of that time whether they are, because none of these processes have the kind of structured, rigorous information that we've gotten used to for really knowing whether volumes 1, 2, and 3 are in the library or not. That's important. I think we'll solve that in some way or another. I'm not ready to accept merely search results in replace of structured and docketed information, but I use a lot more search results than I used to, and maybe I will at some point. The other issue, as big as an elephant in the room, is the issue of preservation of digital data. I love to tell of the book, which was written in the 6th century AD in a monastery in southern Italy, that was not seen by anyone else we know of. Somebody had to see it until an Italian scholar discovered it on top of the armoire in the back of the library in a monastery in northern Italy in 1712. But it had been written on animal skins, and it had been kept indoors where it was dry, and it was just as readable and just in as good shape as what there was, as what had been done, 1,200 years earlier. Try reading digital information that you created 1,200 days ago if you've had a couple of changes of new computers in that time, and you know there's something missing and that folder has gone somewhere and I thought I had it all backed up and really no, I thought it had it all backed up, and you know you don't. The processes whereby you can be sure that information you have now will be there when you want it are far from complete. We'll think about how much. We'll think as a culture about how much we really want to keep and what we don't. Now, what I want to talk about this evening is the reading itself. What happens when you start reading stuff with new devices? So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about a category I call hard reading. Reading can be pleasant. Reading can be beautiful. We can enjoy reading. We can read for relaxation. There are lots of propaganda machines that gear up from time to time during National Library Week. First Lady Laura Bush used to have a library week on the Mall in downtown Washington to just let people know what great fun it is and a great pleasure it is to read. You all would not be in this room if you did not have personal lived experience that reading is not only plainly and simply an easy, relaxing pleasure. Fair enough? You've actually experienced reading of different kinds. And those kinds of reading are good and important in a variety of ways. Here's some of the categories I can think of. Some forms of reading that are difficult because of the form in which they come. We may be changing as a culture in this regard. When I go to visit my boss, the president of the university, for a meeting, I keep picking up the same 19th century Life of Napoleon that sits on a shelf in his outer office. And I've been reading through the good bits. I hadn't read much about Napoleon for a long time, so I sort of cheated, and I started with the 100 Days in Waterloo, and I've just got him shipped off to the island of St. Helena. It's a very ordinary, nobody ever heard of it, late 19th century biography. And I'm really struck by it, that one of the pleasures I'm getting out of it, and I forecast some of what I will say later when I say this, is the pleasure of an elaborately and complicatedly written document. He writes compound, complex sentences. There's parallelism and coordination and fine prose and elegant writing going on. And it's a good yarn about Napoleon and the French army and the British army and their rivalries. That's a form of learned experience. There is difficulty in learning how to do that. There are two forms of benefit that arrive from it. One can be the pleasure. The other can be the precision that a well-crafted tool can perform to, that a less well-crafted tool can't perform to. But there are other ways in which you're used to doing hard reading all the time. Some of the reading is visual, but complex fiction, a really good murder mystery, a really good movie, even a sitcom or a novel usually is difficult with respect to other certain forms of reading. I had poignant experience of this in my life when my mother was fading in her last years and beginning to lose a little cognitive capacity. And what I observed was that the first thing that went were long novels and movies. Because a movie requires you to keep a bunch of stuff in play and make connections over a period of time. The last thing to go, reality TV hadn't been invented yet, bless her, the last things to go were game shows and sitcoms. Because game shows and sitcoms are designed to give you 30-second arcs that are self-contained in their own right, and you can make perfect sense out of them. There's nothing complex about those structures from a point of view of somebody who would consume them. But we've all learned how to watch and argue about The Matrix. We've all learned to watch and argue about a film like The Artist that just won the Academy Award. We're doing quite complex stuff when we do that. I would then take that up one more level and say that there is, in Western and other cultures, traditions of yet more deliberately complex fictions particularly, whether in prose or in verse. I'll simply say Proust and Nabokov. If you are going to read authors of that character, you need to be wide awake, alert, and connecting dots a whole lot of the time away from where the author is pointing. The success and the survival of those works suggests they have value. The difficulty suggests that their audience is probably less than that for contemporary reality television. There's another category which I would characterize as complex material. If you are studying Greek or studying physics, you probably have a large book in front of you with a lot of material, densely packed, highly structured, and where it isn't just you need to keep following the thread and remember that there was an accusative case a few chapters ago. You actually need to have figured out how to do some things with the accusative case and remember it in some detail before chapter 16 of that Greek book ever makes any sense to you at all. That difficulty is real. You put up with it because you want the benefit that comes from mastering that material, but you are probably also willing to look around and look for some help. And so if you have a book, for example, that gives you the irregular forms of all the Greek verbs, you probably pounce on that. But if there are flashcards or a website or drill software, you're willing to do that to help you master this one complex body of material. An interesting, I think, extreme example of what constitutes difficult reading is your experience of reading, indeed, a foreign language that is not native to yourself. And that comes in several stages. There's the first stage when you're just beginning to make sense of the page. I remember when I was beginning to learn German that they said Kafka was pretty easy and straightforward. You should read some Kafka. And after about 6 pages of the beginning of The Castle, I looked up to myself and said, okay, I just finished this page. Was that a sex scene that we just went through? And then I realized that not being sure whether you've just read a sex scene is a novel experience. Most of the time you're pretty sure you have, or you're pretty sure you haven't. There's challenge to that, there's pleasure to that, there's the pleasure of the first discovery that you can make some progress, and you accept the declining degree of difficulty as evidence of progress in mastering something of some complexity, and you're willing to do it because you want to get to the goal that you achieve. There's a mix of pleasure and unpleasure. There's lots about learning a foreign language that is just not fun, but there is a bunch that is fun, and you find ways to mix that. Then there are special books. Books which are not only complex in their own right, but have a lot of cultural complexity built up around them. They tend to be the great canonical books of literary and especially religious traditions. Things like a Bible, a Talmud, a Quran, Kabbalah, Homer, especially Homer as read by scholars in late antiquity who wanted to make it into an allegorical book about philosophy and about the soul. And who therefore wanted you to pay attention to details that you wouldn't otherwise have paid attention to. Time and again, repeatedly, in a wide variety of cultural settings around the world, people have found ways to take very complicated bodies of reading material and make them more complicated in this way, because deep meaning and significant importance is believed to reside inside them. Another category is difficulty that increases with time. If there are any English professors here, you may want to cover your ears for this one, but I have discovered recently that there now exists in our bookstores, you can go to Barnes & Noble and prove this for yourself, such a thing as Shakespeare in English translation. That is to say, for purposes of instruction, people now publish editions of individual plays of Shakespeare with Shakespeare on the right and an English translation on the left. I've looked at a couple of them, enough to know that the text that appears on the left tends to be somewhat god-awful. One might even be tempted to say stale, flat, and unprofitable. But from the point of view of someone who feels a need to be driven through Shakespeare, the cheating on the left-hand side works. Do we all know how to do this? Well, as a matter of fact, I do. For a family member who doesn't know much German but had a German document that she wanted some help with last night, I fed the document through Google Translate, put them in parallel columns, gave it back to her and said, is this enough? And she said, well, you know, I can probably, sure, I'll let you know if I have any questions. There's a tool for mastering a difficulty, but I'm emphasizing here the difficulty with our own culture, with change that happens over time. Shakespeare wasn't always that hard, and looking forward, I will bet you a quarter there will be a time when a whole lot of readers need a lot of help with Shakespeare that they're not now getting. And John Milton can't be far behind either for some help to get your way through Paradise Lost. There's one more form of difficulty which is entirely self-inflicted, but is inflicted with a particular goal in mind. I'd call it the difficulty of inquiry, or the difficulty of scholarship. There are people in this room this evening who have chosen to spend their lives, I'm one of them, deliberately approaching some of the most challenging and remote texts that survive into our time. And as part of a collective enterprise, we have disencrypted what those texts are and built a complex and subtle and extraordinarily true and accurate story of what the history and culture of the ancient world was like. We have to deal with primary materials that can be forbiddingly difficult to read, not only for what they are, but for what they've become. By the time a papyrus or a piece of parchment has become fragmentary and you can barely read the words, it takes extra skill and attention and patience and, yes, hard work to get to the point where you think you've made some sense of it. Over centuries, we've constructed a narrative about the ancient world out of those pieces. And if anything, we've come to a point now where we're working at deconstructing that narrative, figuring out what we've done when we told the story, and understanding our own processes of telling the story as being as much a part of what we're looking at as the things themselves. All of those forms of reading are difficult. They are chosen. They are welcomed. They have different kinds of cultural value, and I'll come back to talk about that in a little while. All of them are, can, and will be changed by changes in the media in which we approach them. But I hope this gives you a frame when I say that reading Cicero on a device like this iPad is no simple matter. Stuff will have changed. Cicero will be different when you read him here. I was reading to you from a 19th century printed edition, which has been digitized by Google Books. It's a little blurry. But on the other hand, I'm not going to own that copy of the 19th century edition, except I can carry it around with me everywhere. When we move Cicero to this device, what changes? What's different? Well, one piece is the dematerialization. The book isn't a book anymore. What this device has taught me is a head game I've been playing on myself all my life. The head game is this. I'm reading a book that I want to read. You've done this too. So what do you do when you stop reading it? You put a bookmark in it, something that sticks out the top, that shows you where you are. And you place this object someplace you will see it again. My bedside table is a really good place for doing that. And when it's time to go to bed at night and I walk into my bedroom and this object is there and the bookmark is there, I get a visual reminder of what I'm doing, how far along I am, a little bit as pleasure, a little bit as guilt, but you know, I'm more than likely when I get in bed to reach for that object, open to that page, and start in again. No bookmarks in the iPad. I've got a book in here on my Kindle reader that I really want to finish. I really want to finish it. I got it in December. I've read half of it. I really am going to finish it. But there's no bookmark sticking out of my Kindle. There's no bookmark sticking out of my iPad. There's nothing saying to me, yo, bozo, no, this is one you want to read. Yo, here's where you are. Come on, read it already. There's probably some other way I can play a game like that with myself, but I haven't found it yet. Because every time I go to the Kindle app on my iPad, you know, there's 19 things there. And they don't have bookmarks sticking out of them. They don't have bookmarks sticking out of them at a particular place through. The paper book that I've got with me in my bag traveling tonight does have that, and there's only 20 pages to go. So I really am likely to get to those 20 pages. I can be 20 pages from the end of something in here and forget about it for a month and a half. That dematerialization also takes away my sense of accomplishment. You've surely had the experience, call it reading War and Peace, the satisfaction of watching the bookmark chug through the pages as you went. The little tchotchke that goes across the bottom that shows you how, and Kindle app telling you how many locations you're at location 296 out of 1530, doesn't work for me in the same way. There's something else that's important about putting it on this device, but I've already essentially said it. The equipresence of many other distractions. When I go to my Kindle app on this device, there's a lot of other things in my Kindle. I've also got iBooks, I've also got Google Books, I've also got this really cool flight scanner thing for watching flight times if somebody I know is traveling. And I've got the Economist app, which I don't actually pay for the magazines, but you get free highlights every week. And then I've got the New Yorker that I'm reading, and then I've got my email, and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff. The blessing of the iPad right now, this is usually taken as a negative in reviews, is you really can only do one thing at a time. You can't have 3 or 4 windows open simultaneously. For that, I need my desktop machine at home with the screen this big and 3 or 4 windows open side by side so that I can write that really important memo and read my email and watch the weather radar at the same time. I'm a different person when I do that from the person who would be sitting in an easy chair with a copy of Cicero, reading nothing but Cicero and knowing there was nothing else to read in the place. It isn't just a device, it's the superabundance of distractions otherwise. The other things that I can reach for, the other things I can do, the radio in the background, the TV in the background, we've all learned to multitask, which is to say we've all learned to distract ourselves. But here's the most distracting thing. it's a whole lot easier to read Cicero than it ever was before. And that's a very dangerous thing. It's a whole lot easier in a variety of ways. First, you can get your hands on him easily. You can get your hands on him anywhere. If I've left my physical copy at home, you know I can download a copy and more or less remember where I was and keep on reading. That's nice. I can find commentaries and annotation and scholarship about Cicero instantaneously. If I use the Perseus website from Tufts University, I can pull up the Latin text and English translation. I can mouse over words and look them up in the dictionary. There's a whole lot of things I can do that don't involve the effort that once upon a time they did. I think I know Latin as well as I do because I was born late enough that my first Latin dictionary was the size of a small handheld paperback. And for about 5 precious years in the 1960s, I could handle that with one hand. I could find the page I needed just by thumbing through the pages and getting to exactly where I wanted to. I'm actually a little sketchy on Latin words beginning with the letter B, because the signature with B in it in that particular book, the pages all stuck together, and it was harder to find them when you went looking for them. But now you hover. You don't need to remember a word. I've taught, many people here have probably taught students that when you're looking a word up in your dictionary, you should always put a dot next to it in the margin, so that way you can go back through the dictionary and see the ones that have a lot of dot next to them in the margin. Okay, I've never actually done that myself, but it really sounds like a good idea, so I've told all my students to do that. Number one, you don't put dots next to words in the margin of your electronic text. And number two, if the effort cost of finding the word in the dictionary is nearing 0, I'm not so motivated to remember it. I don't have to remember it in anything like that way. All sorts of information can be there for me. I can read Cicero a whole lot more easily. This raises one really interesting cultural historical question, which is, what does it mean to know how to read Latin in the year 2012? I don't mean to privilege the year 1960 or 1900, because already the years 1960 and 1900 were abnormal with respect to the history of Latin literature because, A, you had printed texts, B, you had dictionaries, and C, you didn't know how to speak the language. When Cicero was reading Cicero to his brother, he didn't have those kind of dictionaries. He didn't have that kind of easy access to text. He didn't need them because he knew the language in a very different kind of way. The scholar who knew Cicero in 1900 knew a very artificial kind of language. We're going to now know a very different artificial kind of language, and it's going to be in a different place in our brains probably, the neuroscientists will tell us. We'll know different stuff, but we'll still tell ourselves we're knowing Latin. But the ease of reading is what I want to come back to. That has an economic implication. The economic implication is this. Take simple law of supply and demand. The greater the supply, the lower the price. If that's the variable you change, the value of the individual object drops. If all of a sudden there were another umpteen million barrels of oil pumping every day around the world, the price of oil would go down because there was so much. We've lived for thousands of years in a culture in which the written word was precious, in which there weren't enough of them to go around. When my mother graduated from 8th grade in 1928 from a one-room country schoolhouse in upstate New York, her beloved teacher gave her a leather-bound copy of the complete works of William Shakespeare. It was a sacred relic in our family. I still have it, because in the farmhouse she was growing up in, there wasn't much else to read. So by golly, she worked hard on Shakespeare, and she didn't need the translation because it was of such value. Now, with an absolute waterfall, I can tell you that this is the first device I have ever owned that is full of all sorts of reading material, and probably about a third of it I'm not even sure is there. I don't know how it got there. I clicked on something, it's there. If I ever go through all of my Google books, I say, oh, what the heck was that? Where did that come from? My bookshelves have never been like that. I'm fond of quoting a line from the first pages of Henry Adams' great book, Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. It's his book about medieval Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals. It's a gorgeous book. But in a summary at the beginning, he has these words that always come back to my mind. After describing the progression from Romanesque to Gothic and describing the perfection of Gothic in the Cathedral of Chartres in the mid-12th century, he said, the great cathedrals after 1200 show economy, and sometimes worse. The world grew cheap, as worlds must. That sounds wry and ironic and critical in his hands, and it is. He thinks post-1200 cathedrals just aren't anywhere near as fine as the pre-1200 cathedrals. But you know, there were a lot more of them. One aspect of the world growing cheap is things become cheap in the world and it becomes possible for more people to have them and more people to have access to them. I'm worried about what becomes of Cicero, but at the same time, another part of me has to be pleased that Cicero is this available. What I worry about is the attention of the people to whom he is now available. I'm not sure what it would take for a 13-year-old girl in upstate New York now to think that being given a copy of the complete works of Shakespeare was the greatest thing that had happened to her and be something that she remembered and cherished and prized and treasured decades afterwards. I mean, why should we care? Unmistakably, this ease is a very good thing in many, many kinds of ways. Access to information is a thing of beauty if and when it is used. And nothing, it's very important to say this, nothing prevents us from doing all the old things we think are valuable. I mean by that, nothing prevents us from writing with a fountain pen. I have a fountain pen on my desk. I like signing my name with it. I can write with a fountain pen anytime I want to. Not lately, but I can write with a fountain pen. Listening to vinyl records on a turntable. Not my passion, but there are people for whom it is an absolute and consuming passion. And in fact, there's a market that's adjusted itself to provide reconstructed turntables and needles and vinyl copies of records, and there's a market in old vinyl copies of records and people who swear up and down that it's the only way to do things. Nobody is stopping you from listening to records on vinyl if that's what you want to do. Nobody is stopping you from tying shoelaces. You don't have to. This gets a little bit to my kind of issue, though, because you may or may not know, unless you have children the right age, of the recent crisis in the shoelace tying world. The crisis is this. For a very long time in the 20th century, learning to tie shoelaces was an age-specific cognitive and manual achievement for children of a certain age. It was perfectly designed because they could get it very early, that being able to tie your shoes was a good thing to do. They wanted to learn how to tie their shoes and not have mom tie their shoes for them. And it was a really good sort of eye-hand coordination conceptual skill to figure out how to tie shoes and get it right and do it right so the shoes actually stayed on. And there was a little bit of peer pressure from your classmates and whatnot that if everybody you knew was tying their own shoes, you were too embarrassed to go running home to mama to get your shoes tied again, and so forth. Then God invented Velcro. At that point, every smart little child in America and around the world looked at mom and said, tying shoelaces, give me a break, give me some of that good Velcro, I'm out of here. That's progress, that's ease, it makes things easier, it makes things cheaper, no question about it. But last I heard, the pediatricians were scrambling around to try to figure out what else they could ask mothers about their children that would give the same indication of progress and age-specific cognitive and manual development that they had gotten for nothing out of asking whether they could tie their shoes or not for so long. Nothing prevents you from tying shoelaces. There are still lots of shoelaces around. I'm wearing some myself right now. We haven't quite yet gotten to the point where we have to go to special shoelace boutiques in order to find the retro shoelaces. You know, give it a generation, that probably will be the case. There will be other forms of fasteners yet invented. Now, I realize that what I'm doing is presenting a kind of implicit argument that runs like this. Once upon a time, but now, I'm worried. It's a rough form of argument we make in a variety of settings. I can make a variety of arguments. I'm going to suggest three categories. One is I can say, look, this kind of reading I was describing, it trains the brain to really useful transferable skills. If you know how to do this, if you know how to figure things out, if you're good at mastering compound, complex sentences, if you've learned a couple of other languages, you've got skills that can help you in a whole lot of other sort of settings. It's good practice. There's some verifiability to this sort of argument. The neuroscientists and the cognitive scientists and the educational psychologists could tell you whether this is true or not and what the limitations of it are. I'm not any of those things. Hey, I feel it, it works for me. I could tell you that this kind of reading roots you in our culture and other cultures and their failures and their successes. It takes you out of the time and space of the presentism of the 20th and 21st century. Reading will have, going forward, unique power to take you back to the past. On my bad days, I sometimes think that 200 years from now, John F. Kennedy will be remembered as the first president of the United States because he's the first president for whom there's an abundance of video record. And if you're encountering the world through video and audio, he will be living memory. And George Washington and Abraham Lincoln will be people you have to read about. And they will be to the video world what prehistory is to the historic world, if indeed what we do is master the world through what we can see and say. The power of reading will free us from our own time and place, free us from the here and now, and let us understand the human story more deeply. I like that argument too. The most personal form of this is just to say that the arts of reading I've been describing, including the complex forms of reading I've been describing, bring, when you get used to them, surpassing pleasures. The pleasures of reading Proust, or reading Proust in the original, are extraordinary. When I talk about them, I am almost certainly talking about them the way a person with good nose and good palate talks about fine wines. I don't have the nose, I don't have the palate, I'll take the white, please. But at the same time, I respect and understand that there are other people who are getting their money's worth out of the wine in a way that I am never doing. Now, there's some nice old patterns in these arguments that I'm making. The argument from transferable skills, a Roman would call that arguing from what was the useful, the utile. A Roman orator would say that you would make that argument to change people's mind, flectere. Rooting us in our culture and its successes and failures, the Roman orator would say that was the trope of the honestum, the honorable, and that the oratorical style appropriate to it was teaching, docere. Offering pleasure in what you do, that's the pulchrum, the beautiful, and that's the art of delighting, delectare. The first, the training, is aristocratic. Only the few, the proud, and the brave can be trained. The second is more democratic, rooting us all in the culture of the world in which we live. And the possibility of the pleasures that come from this is more than democratic. It is for everyone. At the end of the day, I will confess that one very, very important reason why I do the job that I do as a classicist is because reading Latin, and reading Latin out loud in particular, makes my head feel good. I can tell you that. Some of you are not going to believe me at all. Others of you will nod and say, right on, that's it exactly. But that is purely and simply, at this point, a physically based pleasure that I would not be deprived of for all that I know and have. Okay, those are three forms of argument that I can make. And you can see by the way I'm making them that I am embodying here a judgment about those arguments. You can tell where I come from, you can tell what I stand for, maybe you can tell what I worry about. But if you aren't already convinced by one or more of those arguments, I could keep you here till midnight making those arguments over and over, and it's very, very unlikely that you would get up to walk out of the room and say, I've seen the light, I've been saved, I got to go get me some Cicero in codex form, and the heck with all this technology. Likelihood that I could ever do that? Zip. Nothing. Not there at all. There used to be more of a consensus around some of the things I'm saying than there is now. There's a fraying of that consensus. I think it can be well interpreted as an understanding that there are lots of ways of interacting with the world cognitively, and I'm describing some of them, but there are others, and I acknowledge, of course, that there are others that are good and valuable and make the world a better place. I come at the end, however, to recognizing that we have a piece of business here in colleges and universities in thinking about what's going on around us. I'm not going to persuade anyone tonight. If all of you agree with me and we all charge down to downtown Baltimore and do Occupy Baltimore, each with our copy of Cicero in our hand, we're not going to persuade a whole lot of people that way either. I'm sorry to say that. But we can, in institutions like this, understand the world that we are living in and making in a better way. And I think there are two sets of issues that we in universities, we as academics, we as professors, are not doing enough work on. And they point in the two different directions. On the one hand, I do not see that our curricula and our practice in our classrooms, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, sufficiently focus on what is happening. What changes are happening to the way people think, to the way people process information, to the way we understand our world. because of the flood of information that's becoming available and the tools that are becoming available to process that flood of information. I still wake up in the morning and say to myself, I wonder what I'll have for breakfast. And I think I'm a free, rational individual who decides what it is he's going to have for breakfast. There are a lot of people out there in the world who know better than I do that. The best place I can point you recently is a New York Times Magazine article about a week ago on everything that Target stores know about you and you and you and you and you and me and all of us, and how they know how to make sure we buy what they want us to buy from them when they want us to buy it. They can't get 100% of us. They don't want 100% of us. They can get enough. You know, Target. Target's actually, you know, for one of those cheaper stores, it's actually, they got style, and they got Sam Target, the puppy with the symbol. Yeah, I'll go to Target and buy some stuff. I'm a free, independent individual who's made that decision of my own free will. Or not, as the case may be. So one piece is understanding that which is coming and making it a part of the dialogue of all of our classrooms and all of the places in which we work. And at the same time, understand what it is we have made as a culture of reading and its arts, what value it continues to maintain, and how to continue to present that value and transmit it generation to generation in these kinds of institutions, how to value difficulty, how to value the rare, the special, the challenging, in a world where so much ease and so much cheapness is at hand, for good or evil. These are the things we should be talking about. These are the things we should be learning from one another. And these are the things that, frankly, we should be acting upon in our institutions. When we learn, and when we talk about learning, and when we share that learning with our students. And we shouldn't just go on reading even Cicero on our iPads. Thank you.